Welcome to the video. In this video we're going to take a look at something a little bit different. Now, in the past couple of months we've been making a lot of this style of quadcopter, this kind of flying cross which is really designed for out and out racing. We've built one from pieces on the channel. That's the Quadcopter Building for Beginners Series 2, and we've also looked at a number of ready-to-fly versions of this stuff as well. Now, this is a kit that we've got from FlyPro. It's called the XJaguar. Details are on the website flypro.com. I'll put a link in the description so you can go and find it. And this feels like a kit that they've put a little bit of thought into and trying to put all the best stuff in here. So for example, it has a RunCam camera and the power distribution board, on-screen display, FPV electronics are all a bit funky too. So very quickly, what I'd like to do is show you kind of what comes in the box. I'm not going to do the build as part of the video. I'll talk about the build and I'll draw your attention to anything that's particularly interesting. The reason for that is that the build looks really straightforward. Looking at the manual itself, that you can download from the flypro.com website. If you download the manual, it has all of the instructions and it looks like a pretty straightforward build. So we're going to try and follow this as easily as we can. The real interesting thing on this for me is the fact that they've designed this little stackable setup of components that goes into the middle. Now, we've seen other flight controllers that have done similar things, but this is one that we haven't looked at yet. And the idea that you can have the transmitter and on-screen display on one board, an F3 based flight controller on another, and all the ESCs, including the XT60 connector at the bottom, makes it a really interesting little setup. With that in the middle, everything else would be pretty straightforward. Now, the only thing that I figured out, which took me ages, I was having a really bad day, was the top of this thing is designed to look like a snarling Jaguar head. Nice little bit of detail. It took me ages to figure out why there was all these pieces cut into it. So let me just show you kind of what comes in the box, and this is why, you know, it's quite impressive when you get it and you start taking it apart. So here is our FPV camera with a mount. Looks like a little RunCam Swift. We've looked at those on the channel. They're nice little cameras. We have a set of props. We have the individual motors, and these are FlyPro motors. They're GT2205 2300 kVs, so pretty standard stuff. Bearings feel quite nice on those. So you get 4 motors. The props here are those 3 control boards with the power distribution board and speed controllers. There they all are plugged in onto the bottom. So we just need to put the 3 wires from the motors onto here. A little riser ready to plug into, because this is the flight controller. And there underneath, hopefully the camera will pick that up. You got the little pins that are going to plug into that riser, just like that. And then the top piece, which is the FPV system, and the on-screen display is then going to plug, similar, just with the pins, is going to plug in there too. So that's a very, very cute way of doing it. So that's the top level. Second level, then we have things like the frames, we have the arms. The arms are nice and thick, looks like 4mm carbon fibre, and they're actually nicely finished. I'm not taking off any bits of skin as I'm rubbing around with them, so that's nice. And we also have a battery in here as well, so we'll give that a go and see how that goes. But that means that pretty much everything you need is here in the box to make this little guy, with the exception of a radio receiver. So let me just stop the video there. I'm going to start putting this thing together. I'm going to follow the instructions as they are in the manual, and I'll come back and comment on any things that caught me out as part of the build. Actually putting this thing together is a little bit more tricky than I expected, because although the pieces go together quite easily, the lack of instructions and simple tips and tricks make it a little bit more complicated. So what I'm going to try and do is document how I did it here, and also point out the things that I found out on the way that will hopefully make sure that you don't avoid some of the same pitfalls that I found when I was playing with it. First thing is to add the motors to the arms themselves. The motors are directional. They will obviously rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise, but the threads on them are different. So there are 2 designed for clockwise rotation, two designed for counterclockwise. The only way you're going to find out is actually screwing on the prop nuts to figure that out. Installing them on the arms is important as the first step too, because once you've got that done, it'll make the arms fitting a little bit easier. If you try and fit the arms first, you could potentially put them upside down, and the holes to mount into the motors at the bottom are only drilled to work in one way. So once you've got all the motors together, then it's just a case of getting the bottom plate and screwing the arms to the bottom plate through the bottom carbon piece into that spacer. And when they're all together, they'll fit really neatly. Once you've done that, then you can push the much longer screws up through the bottom of the plate. The middle holes in the red anodized brace aren't threaded, so they just push straight up, and then that becomes the foundation to put the stack together of the flight controller and the other pieces. Once we have the power distribution board in place, then the next job is obviously to do the soldering. So just snip the wires to the right length and make them off onto the power distribution board, because we don't need any other ESCs. All that goodness is there on that bottom board. As you can see here, I've made a couple of 3D printable mounts just to keep the wires out of the way, although just a little bit of black insulation tape wrapped around the arm would do the same job as well. I'm sure that's an unnecessary step, but I don't like the idea of these things flopping around when the props are running. Once we've got that done, then it's just a case of plugging the other boards into position with the spacers, topping it off with the FPV transmitter and on-screen display board at the very top, and using the 4 provided nuts to keep it in place. It does provide a very, very neat stack. The only thing I will say here is trying to do these little nuts up at the top is quite tricky. There's lots of components very close to them. I, unfortunately, using snipe nose pliers, managed to destroy one of the little LEDs in the corner. Luckily, it was nothing more crucial than that, but do be very careful when you're putting these things on. I didn't have anything that would drive these nuts home, so I had to use something like snipe nose pliers. If they're going to put these components so close to these kind of pieces, adding something in the box that would help you drive these nuts home without damaging components would potentially have been quite a nice idea. Once you've got that done, that's pretty much the base put together, then it's putting the top. So what you do is get one of the aluminium sides, and then you attach the main components as we've shown here. Then it's a case of installing the antenna mount, the camera itself, and also the little board that has the buzzer in the middle and the LED light at the back as well. Now, it is important to start connecting up some of the wires before you put the other side on, and what I personally recommend is don't do the screws up really tightly, because you have to push this thing down over the top of that stack of electronics that you've just built on the base, and if it's too tight you'll end up potentially rubbing against the USB connector or damaging the kit below. So with that in mind, let me just show you the cables that we've had to install here. Again, the instructions are lacking a little bit here, so you have to kind of figure this out. There's one wire that goes into the bottom of the LED and buzzer strip. That's got the 4 wires on it. You're also going to have to find the cable that goes into the back of the camera. That's also going to fit at the bottom part. I'll show you where all this fits in a minute. And then the only other thing out of the top, of course, is the flying lead from the antenna mount that snaps onto the antenna output on the very top board of the stack we've just made. So fitting this over, what I would do is just take your time with this. In the end, what I did was actually took off one of the sides of this kind of head mounted piece, so one of these kind of bright red Jaguar symbols, and installed everything very gently, and then once it was all put in place, then I kind of reaffixed the Jaguar head. And I did that just to make sure that I wasn't putting too much strain on any of the cables, because it is a lovely thing when it actually goes together, but it's a little bit tight in here. So tight, in fact, that if you're using something like an X4R with an FR Sky, which is what we're going to use with this model, there isn't any room, sadly, in here. If they'd have just give us an extra 2 or 3 millimeters underneath where all the electronics mount and the camera mounts, then it would have been great. The camera could be mounted slightly further forward. My concern would be that it's going to get hit in the event of a crash. So here it is all together. Here is the connectors all plugged in. So that's where the camera goes, there to the front. So that's the cable that goes up to the back of the camera, and it plugs into the video transmitter board at the top. Then at the back we have the cable coming out of the bottom of the buzzer LED setup, and that is then plugging into that port at the back of the flight controller. And the last one is where we're going to plug the receiver in. Now there are two cables in the kit, one that looks like this with all the connections on, and another one that is just set up to have the three cables. Now the challenge that I have, I've just said, is I haven't really got any place to put this, which is such a shame. It's such a beautiful compact machine, but potentially they've made it a little bit too compact. I don't want to put it on the top, maybe it'll go on the side. So that's unfortunately something that I'm going to have to figure out before we plug it in and have a look at it on the computer. This is how we ended up installing the X4R onto the back of the craft. So we're getting to the point now where we need to plug it into the computer to see what CleanFlight can see. Plugging the model into CleanFlight shows that everything appears to be working, so that the accelerometers seem fine, so that's good. We just have a gyro and accelerometer, nothing in the data flash. That probably means that the board has never been powered up or armed. So what I would do is go through and configure everything as though it's a brand new flight controller without any configuration at all. Now all the things that I'm going to show you and we've been through in here are stuff that if you're not familiar with and it's not making sense, I'd heartily recommend you go and watch our Quadcopter Building for Beginners Series 1 or ideally Series 2. In Series 2 we used BL Heli to change the direction of some of the motors, and in here we ended up having to do that. So very quickly, here's the setup. So it's set up for a Quad X. Motor stop isn't turned off. One shot 125 is. The throttle minimum and maximum seems to be set. Then going into the receiver mode, nothing initially was working for me because it was set up by default for PPM, so I had to go into the ports tab, set UART3 as serial receiver, then go into the receiver tab and scroll down and then select S-Bus. Once I did that, everything worked. Here's the default settings in terms of the modes. So the low mode position is angle, medium is horizon, and top will be rate, which is perfect. That's how I tend to fly by default. It's arming via a switch, which is fine when we're using things like we're not turning the motors off and we're also going to use air mode, then that's a great idea. Interestingly, air mode isn't turned on here, so I'm going to enable it for horizon and rate mode. Last thing to show you then is just jumped into the CLI type version, and we can see that the flight controller is running the code for an SP Racing F3. So we'll try a flight on CleanFlight. That's how this thing's come configured. A little bit disappointed it hasn't come with Betaflight, but for now let's just try it with CleanFlight, and Betaflight is probably something we can flash in the future. Last thing I'll talk about is the fact that we did use BL Heli Suite. Two of the motors were turning in the wrong direction, and again, if you're not sure how to use that, go and have a look at Quadcopter Building for Beginners Series 2. Towards the end of that series we actually used BL Heli Suite to reverse two of the motors in software, and we had to do that here, and then that was fine. Last thing of course was to balance the props, and then here it is all together, ready to go out and give it a test flight. As you can see, it's quite striking with the top on. We have gone and set up the FPV video transmitter as well. That is a little bit interesting. There's a very small button at the back that's quite tricky to get to, and then the channel designation is on the front with a series of 4 LEDs that light up in a slightly random pattern. It's listed in the manual, but it's not something that you'd remember easily at the field. And at the back you have all of the settings for the other race bands as well. So I've just put it on to F1, which is what my Fat Shark goggles tend to be set as. So I'm going to pop a slightly more sophisticated FPV antenna on the top of here, and let's go to the field and try it out. First time I took it to the field, I did notice how actual pretty it is. We built it indoors, and then taking it out and plonking it down on our little flying mat. The build is super sleek with all the electronics and components tucked away in the middle. It looks fantastic, and that red anodized head, although initially potentially a little goofy looking, actually makes it very striking. With any model with these kind of motors, the ESCs and setup, it's going to be quick on 4S, and this is absolutely the same. Tons and tons of power and very fast. We've looked at lots of models on the channel which have been 2205, 2300 motors with 4S setups, and all of them have been blistering in terms of the way they fly. The camera is performing very well. You'd expect that. It's a Runcam Swift. The Runcam Swift is very nice. There's actually some new lenses coming out that we're going to try on this in the next couple of weeks. Field of view is pretty good. The way it's handling this very overcast day is great. The on-screen display is nice too. I'll probably turn off all the gubbins in the middle. I tend to find that a little distracting. But the fact that's all worked out the box without having to flash anything or set anything up or grab an FTDI adapter is pretty impressive. So let's go through the good things about this. The performance, as we've said, is absolutely as you'd expect from something with these kind of motors and props on a 4S setup. It is nice and nippy. The electronics, I think, are the star of the show in here. This stack of electronics with the power distribution board, the flight controller, and then the on-screen display and video transmitter stuff at the top is absolutely beautiful. We've looked at quite a few of these. The way it goes together just all fits, and not only all fits, but it's actually all set up ready to rock and roll, shows that it's been set up with a bit of care. The build has been a lot of fun too. The reason that I documented it is because there's no real build manual out there, and we'll talk about that in a sec, but the actual build itself, once I figured out how it went together, was a real fun thing to do. It is a little bit fiddly in places. The tolerances in a couple of spots are really tight, so do absolutely take your time to make sure that you don't do what I do and take off one of the LEDs by having your little snipe nose pliers a little bit too far down the nuts. It would have been nice, like I said, if they'd have had something to allow you to spin those nuts home without potentially catching the electronics that are so closely mounted. So a couple of things that I will point out. First of all, there isn't a build manual, so if you do want to build one of these, then if you follow through the steps that we've just gone through in the video, you'll actually get it all sorted. It was a little bit easier than we expected, and it was a very fast build indeed. I wish there was more room up here to mount an action camera. At the moment, if you want to put a GoPro or anything else on here, there's no real room, and apart from these little eyelets here in the mount, there we go, you can just about see it on the camera, there isn't a way to get a strap across there to mount a Mobius or something like that. I quite like to have a Mobius to record the flight from the bird's eye view, so unfortunately for me that's a bit of a shame. We could potentially make something work here by having a strap that goes underneath, but it would have been nice if that had been built into the frame as it came. Be aware that there is very limited space. There is some space in there, hopefully you can see, to get a very small receiver in there. An XSR would have probably fit, but we didn't have one on the day, so we've ended putting our receiver here at the side, and that actually works fine. It just spoils the aesthetic from that side. So do be aware of that, and it's nicely out the way of the props as well. I use my little trick here, which is using a little cocktail straw with two little nicks in it about 8mm apart. You put the antennas through, a little bit of hot glue to hold it in place, and that then acts as a very lightweight support to make sure that these things don't droop down into the props. Couple of tips. The video transmitter with these lights acting in combination to show you the channel and the band that you have selected, do take that to the field with you. Trying to figure that out if you haven't got all that information with you is a bit tricky. The last tip I'll give you is this little switch here, just above where the buzzer and the lights plug in, is the one that you press to change the band and the frequency. Short press will change the channel that you're using, a long press will change the band. The other tip with that is if you press and hold it in as you apply power, the lights will blink on the video transmitter. A slow blinking means you're on the lower power setting, fast blinking means you're on the higher power setting. That was just a little tip that wasn't documented anywhere in the stuff that we had, that I found by looking on the forums. This was a really beautiful thing to build, and the performance is exactly as you'd expect from the components that are in there. The fact that everything just worked out the box was beautiful. For the amount of money that they're asking for this, there are ready to fly quads around, but don't forget that those quads typically aren't coming with a battery. The battery that came with this is rated at 100C. I don't know whether that's real or not, but it's easily enough to get this thing hooting around your local field or racetrack without any problems at all. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel, and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, Subscribe and happy flying.